title of my contribution is Eccentric Characters in Ada Negri's Work, Proposals for an Inclusive Teaching of Italian Literature. Thank you to the organizers. I am glad to present my idea. Raised in a porter's lodge in the shadow of an aristocratic household, Ada Negri turns her proletarian origins into both literary material and ideological claim. Her position remains suspended between two worlds. On one side, the brutal reality of poverty that wears down and at times disables bodies. On the other, a bourgeois order grounded in physical well-being and an ideal of femininity and masculinity from which non-conforming bodies are excluded. Such tension runs through her oeuvre and shapes the contradictions of her representation of bodily difference. Long overshadowed by Benedetto Croce's verdict on her alleged lack of poetry, and later complicated by her movement from socialist sympathies to fascist alignment, Negri has been reassessed as a central figure in 20th century women's writing, especially for her prose. The experience of class oppression in Negri's case is inseparable from female agency. It was her mother, Vittoria Cornalba, a factory worker who lost a hand in an industrial accident, who made it possible for Ada to study and enter national intellectual circles. Her debut poem, Hand in the Gear, collected in Fatalità, reworks that accident, framing disability not as divine punishment or metaphysical curse, but as a condition produced by labor, class, and economic vulnerability, and not, however, as an inescapable one, as her mother's determination in supporting her daughter's intellectual ascent makes clear. Yet the prose works of the early 20th century, especially the short story collections, develop an ambivalent vision of bodily nonconformity. They expose the cruelty of social stigma, making readers aware of the suffering imposed on scarred, deformed, or marginalized bodies. At the same time, they often seem unable fully to reject the very assumptions that justify such exclusion. Critics have noted that her work often remains poised between innovation and conservatism. Her denunciations of women's oppression, social injustice, and bodily stigma are real, yet they are not always able to free themselves from moralistic frameworks. This is evident in her treatment of disability, where social critique coexists with residues of an ableist imagination the author herself never entirely transcends. This proposal explores that ambivalence and its pedagogical implication. Negri's representation of disability oscillates between critique and complicity, between an attention to lives marked by exclusion and an attachment to cultural models that associate bodily difference with failure or social maladjustment, a tension that reflects the divide between her proletarian and bourgeois soul. Her narratives reveal how deviation from the norm is read as a disturbance of the social order, something to be corrected or symbolically compensated. At the same time, they open spaces of resistance, especially in relation to women, whose bodies are judged within a patriarchal system that reduces their value to beauty, integrity, and reproductive or marital function. In light of these tensions, Negri's work offers a field for examining early 20th century Italian representations of disability in their intersections with gender and class, intersections that also make these texts productive for inclusive literary teaching. The article draws on three short stories, Nella nebbia, Il suo diritto, and Ombra, to demonstrate how literature can function as a pedagogical instrument for cultivating awareness of human diversity. Rather than concentrating on textual microanalysis, it isolates those narrative linguistic features useful for a university seminar in Italian literature within Italian studies programs abroad, encouraging students to reflect on dimensions of the disability culture nexus, stigmatizing language, the spectacularization of the disabled body, family dynamics and secondary disability, and the intersections of sexuality and impairment. Theoretical framework. Building on recent scholarship that conceives of disability as a dynamic social construct, shifting in relation to value systems, this analysis adopts an interdisciplinary framework that integrates Charles Gardou's classification of disability models and Irving Goffman's theory of stigma. Applied to literary texts, these frameworks reveal the conditions under which narrative representations of disability can be mobilized in educational practice. Gardou's functional relational approach provides a starting point. It displaces disability from an ontological essence to a contingent relation between the individual and the environment, reconfiguring it not as a thing located in the body, but as a dissonance produced at the intersection of corporeal conditions and socio-cultural context. Within this framework, 4 models can be identified. The subtractive model, which interprets disability as deficit or loss. The exogenous model, which attributes it to external causes and assigns moral blame. The malefic model, which frames it as social deviance. The benefic model, which regards it as a source of growth and transformation. Negri's narratives activate all 4 models, often in tension with one another. Goffman's theory of stigma illuminates the social processes through which disability is devalued. Defined as an attribute that reduces its bearer from a whole and usual person to a tainted, discounted one, stigma operates as a mechanism of social reduction, relegating the disabled to positions of inferiority. This perspective highlights that exclusion is not merely the outcome of physical limitations, but the product of symbolic labeling and cultural hierarchies. Together, these theoretical tools reveal the symbolic grid through which disability is culturally coded in Negri's fiction, and thus provide students with material for critical engagement. Imprisoned Bodies and Social Stigma, Literary Readings. The 3 short stories examined below reveal Negri's literary engagement with disability. Read together, they foreground 3 recurrent dynamics: the determining force of the social gaze, the role of the family in configuring the lived experience of impairment, and the way disability is inflected by gender and sexuality. In The Veil of Fog, Disability, Stigma and Desire, the protagonist of Nella Nebbia Raimonda bears facial disfigurement caused by a childhood domestic accident. The right side of her face was horribly scarred from a bed fall onto the live embers of a fire when she was 10. Ironically, she had grown to be beautifully formed, artless, passionate, clearly made for a life of love. If only the shriveled heart mask, which forced her mouth into a grotesque smirk, had not disfigured her irreparably. Negri constructs the character through a contrast between bodily grace and visible scar, thereby exposing the violence of a social logic that reduces the person to one stigmatized feature. In Gardou's terms, Raimonda is read according to the subtractive model, as someone deprived of the beauty expected of women. At the same time, the accident activates the exogenous model, since blame is displaced onto the mother and the domestic sphere. What matters most in the story is not the scar itself, but the social process that turns it into destiny. Raimonda is absorbed into categories such as monster and unworthy. The refusal of mirrors, the sense of humiliation, and the perception of an invisible barrier separating her from others all show that stigma functions less as a medical fact than as an internalized social verdict. In this respect, the story resonates with social model approaches such as Mike Oliver's, insofar as disability emerges from material and symbolic barriers to participation, rather than from bodily condition alone. The story's climax unfolds in the fog, where obscured visibility enables Raimonda to experience a sense of connection. A man who cannot see her face in the mist harasses and then kisses her. The act is intrusive, yet the narrative frames the fog as a metaphor for the social barriers that prevent intimacy. Within it, both Raimonda and the man are equally disabled in visual perception, producing a condition of parity that makes connection imaginable. Because visibility is blurred, Raimonda experiences a moment of intimacy otherwise denied to her. Yet the scene does not produce liberation. Once visibility returns, so too do the social mechanisms that regulate desire and belonging. Negri thus exposes both the fragility of agency under oppressive norms and the structural nature of stigma. When disability comes to the stage, the courage of Lucetta. Il suo diritto returns to facial disfigurement, but relocates the problem within artistic performance. Lucetta, scarred by a curling iron that her mother had inadvertently left on, becomes an accomplished pianist. Her story therefore asks whether talent can alter the social meanings attached to disability. The narrative is filtered through the perspective of Lucetta's mother, whose self-blame exemplifies Gardou's exogenous model. Negri makes visible the way disability reverberates through the family system. Guilt becomes emotional paralysis, and hostility toward the non-disabled son. In this sense, the story suggests a form of secondary disability, affecting caregivers consumed by remorse and by the internalization of social stigma. Lucetta's musical career seems, at first, to offer compensation, as her art commands admiration. Yet Negri makes this process ambiguous. Disability is not erased. Rather, it becomes part of the spectacle. The concert stage confers legitimacy only by transforming Lucetta's body into an object of visibility, where beauty, damage, and sublime interpretation are apprehended together. The same precariousness governs the sphere of affect. Lucetta does not imagine herself entitled to love. Even the relationship with the cellist is conceived as a concession rather than an enduring right. The story's conclusion, Lucetta's death in childbirth and the birth of a daughter who resembles her before the accident, is ambivalent. It restores continuity only by implying that narrative conflict is resolved through the disappearance of the disabled woman and the symbolic replacement of impairment with normative wholeness. Shadowed lives in Ombra. Ombra shifts disability onto the male body and therefore widens Negri's inquiry into desire and social legitimacy. Giorgio Palowski becomes blind after a suicide attempt, and the narrative initially frames this blindness through an exogenous Gardot's model that binds impairment to guilt. At the same time, Negri introduces a benefic dimension, since blindness appears to generate moral deepening and sensitivity. Serena Argenti, blind from birth, offered a different possibility. She is neither tragic nor self-loathing. As a musician, she embodies a plural understanding of existence. The relationship with Giorgio initially seems to suspend normative hierarchies, as shared blindness allows an intimacy grounded in affective and sensory reciprocity. Yet his alternative proves unstable once sexuality enters the narrative. At that point, the text reverts to a stigmatizing lexicon. Giorgio's marriage is figured as an error, conjugal intimacy as a profanation, the couple's blindness as something that, within sexuality, loses its purity. Negri thereby registers the cultural anxiety surrounding disabled erotic life. The disabled body may be tolerated as suffering, but it becomes scandalous when it claims full sexual citizenship. Even the birth of a sighted child functions as symbolic correction. Read against Nella Nebbia and Il suo diritto, Ombra confirms Negri's persistent tendency to cast disability as a form of imprisonment, while also extending her analysis to masculine experience and the taboo of disabled sexuality. Pedagogical implications. Building on the analysis above, this section proposes a workflow for classroom implementation, calibrated for a university seminar in Italian literature within Italian studies programs abroad, a context where women writers and disabled characters remain marginal in the canon. The activities outlined below are designed to develop both close reading competence and awareness of the cultural construction of disability, moving students beyond tolerance toward engagement with human difference. Reframing stigmatizing language in Nella Nebbia. Instructors may begin with selected passages from Nella Nebbia, directing attention to vocabulary that describes Raimonda. Expressions such as monstrosity, a grotesque grimace, atrocious half-mask, inexorability of her hideousness, can be isolated and annotated for critical analysis. These terms reveal how the narrative voice participates in processes of othering by associating disability with deformity and grotesqueness. Although Negri registers Raimonda's suffering with empathy, she simultaneously imposes a value-laden perspective that distances the protagonist from full personhood. This linguistic analysis helps students perceive stigma not as a reflection of bodily reality, but as a cultural and rhetorical construction. Following Hollander, instructors may then introduce a creative rewriting exercise. Students select one or two stigmatizing descriptions and reformulate them without dehumanizing terminology, emphasizing instead interiority, resilience, or relational capacity. The point is not to erase disability, but to test how language governs perception. As Causarano argues, teaching with literature means providing students with tools to unmask stereotypes and to imagine inclusive narratives. A comparative extension may place Negri alongside coeval Italian works, using Pirandello's fiction on physical impairment as discussed by Lorenzetti. Finally, for each text, a table will be provided listing the nouns, adjectives, and adverbs referring to the body to identify the qualities and intensity of the ableist lexicon present in Negri's story, Il suo diritto. Lend itself to a second activity on the relation between impairment and artistic expression. Students examine passages centered on Lucetta's performances, tracing the audience's reactions of admiration, curiosity, unease, and concealed disgust. Such analysis makes clear that the narrative frames disability as simultaneously overcome and hypervisible. Artistic mastery legitimizes Lucetta's presence while transforming her condition into spectacle. These may be contextualized through the cultural history of freak shows and bodily exhibition. As Mascherini has argued, the portrayal of monstrosity often relied on the grotesque and the excessive, constructing a body that was at once terrifying, ludicrous, and captivating. Students may therefore compare Negri's lexical choices with those found in newspaper articles or accounts of freak performances, identifying recurring expressions of astonishment, admiration, fear, and disgust. By setting Lucetta's concert hall visibility beside those earlier dispositives of display, students can explore how disability circulates between prestige and objectification. A final stage may open onto contemporary digital culture, where disabled influencers reclaim visibility through social media, including creators with intellectual disabilities and physical disabilities, negotiating recognition and commercial collaboration. The framework has changed, but visibility remains ambivalent. Empowerment may coexist with voyeurism or morbid curiosity. Juxtaposing Negri with these cases enables students to identify both continuity and transformation in the spectacularization of disability. A third activity, based on Nella Nebbia and Il suo diritto, should focus on the maternal figures who are central to Negri's understanding of disability within the family. Both texts tie impairment to maternal responsibility and depict the mothers as overwhelmed, remorseful, and at times incapable of care. Students may compare the two mothers by identifying the lexical and narrative markers associated with guilt, fatigue, protection, and inadequacy to assess how caregiving is represented as both effective labor and source of stigma. Attention may also be paid to differences in focalization. While Il suo diritto grants broader access to the mother's perspective, Nella Nebbia keeps maternal experience more external, thus producing a different framing of disability and care. Students can thus reflect on the domestic circulation of stigma and on forms of secondary disability affecting caregivers. A comparative extension with present-day debates on care may illuminate how assistance can function simultaneously as necessity and burden. A final activity addresses the intersection of sexuality and disability across all three stories. Students compare the exceptional conditions under which intimacy becomes possible, the concealing fog in Nella Nebbia, the temporary prestige of art in Il suo diritto, and the sensory world of two blind protagonists in Bombara. This comparative map makes visible a recurrent pattern. Disabled desire is narratively allowed only through mediation, suspension, or anomaly. The focus may then narrow to Bombara, where lexical choices such as error and profanation betray a profound unease toward disabled sexuality and encode eugenic anxieties. The symbolic value assigned to the sighted child at the end of the story offers a useful point of discussion, since it reveals how reproductive legitimacy is bound to bodily normativity. A concluding comparison with contemporary disability studies and activism, where sexual rights and the recognition of disabled people as full sexual subjects are central, enables students to measure historical distance without overlooking persistent prejudice. This presentation has examined an author whose representations of disability are complex and multi-layered, revealing the persistent ambivalence between acceptance and repulsion, compassion and critique, inclusion and marginalization that non-disabled observers often display. Negri's prose, attuned to interiority and social environment, offers a lens onto intellectual and everyday attitudes toward disability in early 20th century Italy, making visible the cultural roots of exclusions that are far from extinct. The composite theoretical framework, Gardu's models, and Goffman's stigma theory, demonstrates that Negri's stories represent disability not as an ontological given, but as a dynamic construction shaped by value systems, cultural prejudices, and lived embodiment. Three recurring dynamics emerge across the narratives: disability as imprisonment of both body and desire, the ambivalent aestheticization of impaired bodies, and the confinement of disabled sexuality to zones of exception, transgression, or moral anxiety. Crucially, Negri herself is never fully outside the ableist imaginary she anatomizes. Her empathy is real, but her narrative resolutions repeatedly restore the order they have momentarily disturbed. By bridging literary criticism and classroom practice, the pedagogical proposals outlined here translate the insights of disability studies into activities suited to a university seminar in Italian studies abroad, using Negri's texts not only as objects of analysis, but as catalysts for reflecting on stigma, language, and social justice. In this way, the study of canonical texts avoids superficial modernization and instead becomes a means of interrogating present-day problems while making their cultural roots visible, enabling students to imagine more equitable social life.